In the late autumn of 1974, inside a sprawling assembly plant in Charles City, Iowa, the heavy machinery continued to run. The foundry still poured iron. The workers still bolted engine blocks to transmission housings. But something fundamental was quietly erased from the floor. For decades, the tractors rolling off this specific Midwestern assembly line wore a distinct coat of meadow green paint. That color was a promise to the American farmer. It was a visual guarantee of high torque, six-cylinder power that pulled plows through the heavy soils of the Corn Belt. But on this day, the meadow green paint stopped flowing. The spray guns were loaded with a stark, cold corporate silver. When the finished tractors rolled out into the Iowa sunlight, the name Oliver was gone from the sheet metal. It was replaced entirely by the branding of the White Motor Corporation. The company that had literally coined the word tractor in this very town was wiped out of existence, while its own factories were still actively building machines. A decade earlier, that same brand commanded absolute loyalty across Illinois, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. Oliver was the benchmark for smooth, continuous power. The machines did not fail in the field. The local dealers did not abandon their rural customers. But the real story of Oliver tractors in America is not merely a tale of a paint color changing on an assembly line. It is the story of independent Midwestern engineering excellence colliding with the ruthless mathematics of corporate conglomerates. It is the story of what happens when a machine built for the soil is captured by a balance sheet, and how the pursuit of pure industrial scale silenced one of the most trusted names in American agriculture. Every week, we document the empires of iron that built American agriculture, and the structural forces that ultimately tore them down. Subscribe if you believe these forgotten machines, and the working towns that forged them still matter. The story of Oliver does not end with corporate silver in the 1970s. It begins decades earlier, just as the American farm faced an entirely different kind of collapse. The origin of the Oliver tractor is not a story of a single inventor having a singular revelation. It is the story of a desperate, calculated survival pact between four industrial empires forged on the eve of an American economic collapse. To understand the machines that would eventually wear the meadow green paint, one must look at the two distinct forces that built them. The first was born in Charles City, Iowa. In 1901, two mechanical engineers named Charles W. Hart and Charles H. Parr began building stationary gasoline engines. They soon mounted these heavy two-cylinder power plants onto steel wheels to replace steam engines in the field. They needed a single word to describe their new gasoline traction engines. They combined the terms, and the word tractor officially entered the American commercial vocabulary. The second force was born in South Bend, Indiana. In 1857, a foundryman named James Oliver perfected the chilled plow, an implement made by pouring cast iron into a mold equipped with chilling blocks. The rapid cooling created a plowshare with a surface as hard as glass and as smooth as ice. In the sticky, dense loam of the Midwestern prairie, standard cast iron or wood plows quickly accumulated thick layers of mud. The farmer had to stop every few yards, climb down, and scrape the blade clean. The Oliver chilled plow, however, scoured itself. It sliced through the soil cleanly. It turned the earth without hesitation. By the 1920s, both Hart Parr and the Oliver Chilled Plow Works were highly respected names across the United States. But the American agricultural market was changing rapidly, and single-product manufacturers were suddenly highly vulnerable. Before this decade, an American farmer operating a mid-sized acreage in Illinois or Nebraska lived in a fragmented equipment ecosystem. Draft horses still performed the majority of the precise row crop work. When a farmer did begin to mechanize, he purchased a heavy lumbering tractor from one local agent. He bought a plow from a second dealer. He sourced a thresher from a third manufacturer. The engine and the implement were strangers to one another. They were not engineered as a cohesive unit. This fragmentation became a fatal weakness. Giant corporations, most notably International Harvester, were actively building full lines, a complete, integrated catalog of equipment where the tractor, the cultivator, and the harvest machinery were designed together, painted the same color, and sold through a single heavily financed local dealership. Independent factories realized they could not compete against this massive scale. Furthermore, the American farm economy had collapsed shortly after World War I. Crop prices plummeted. Farm debt soared. The agricultural sector was already deep into a severe depression a full decade before Wall Street crashed. Survival demanded consolidation. On February 15, 1929, four distinct companies executed a historic merger. Hart Parr of Iowa, the Oliver Childe Plow Works of Indiana, the Nichols and Shepard Thresher Company of Michigan, and the American Seeding Machine Company of Ohio combined their manufacturing assets, their patents, and their remaining capital. They formed the Oliver Farm Equipment Company. The timing was brutally unlucky. The new corporation was finalized just 8 months before the stock market crash of October 1929. The newly unified company launched its massive operations directly into the teeth of the Great Depression and the devastating droughts of the Dust Bowl. Yet from this crucible of economic misery emerged the machine that would define the brand's early American entry. In 1930, the company introduced the Oliver row crop 18 to 27. It was a row crop tractor, a machine specifically designed to work between planted rows, utilizing an adjustable wheel spacing and high clearance, so the operator could cultivate crops without destroying them. The engineering was stark, functional, and highly focused on Midwestern soil dynamics. The machine featured a narrow tricycle front end, allowing it to navigate between tight corn rows. More importantly, it rolled on a unique rear wheel design known as tiptoe wheels, open steel rims fitted with sharp, spade-like lugs that penetrated the ground deeply. Instead of packing the topsoil into a hard, impenetrable crust, the tiptoe wheels transferred the tractor's weight below the surface, preserving the fragile seedbed. In the early 1930s, the Oliver row crop 18 to 27 carried a purchase price of roughly $1,050 in period currency, the equivalent of approximately $22,000 today. For a family farm in Iowa facing 10-cent corn and impending foreclosure, this was an astronomical sum. Purchasing a new tractor during this era was not an upgrade. It was a calculated risk of total bankruptcy. The early reception in the American market relied entirely on the brute force of the newly combined dealer network. The company had to stitch together 4 separate, fiercely independent distribution chains into a single sales force. Trade publications of the period, including the widely read Implement and Tractor magazine, noted the aggressive engineering of the row crop. But engineering alone did not sell machines in 1931. The local dealers did. In states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Minnesota, these newly minted Oliver dealers fought for every single sale. They arranged local field demonstrations. They took used draft horses, worn-out steam engines, and harvested grain as trade-ins. They extended personal credit to farmers who could not secure a bank loan. The Oliver Farm Equipment Company survived its brutal first decade in America not simply because Charles City built a reliable engine or because South Bend cast a perfect plow. It survived because its local dealers held the line, binding the farmer's financial survival directly to the Meadow Green iron. By the mid-1930s, the American tractor market was dominated by a brutal, bone-shaking reality. The vast majority of machines pulling plows across the Midwest relied on massive, low-speed 2-cylinder or 4-cylinder engines. These power plants were loud, they were heavy, they vibrated with such violence that they routinely loosened their own chassis bolts, numbed the hands of the operator, and turned a 10-hour day in a Kansas wheat field into a grueling physical ordeal. John Deere had built an empire on the reliable but violently shaking two-cylinder machines. International Harvester relied on the rugged, utilitarian four-cylinder Farmall. The engineers at the Charles City plant looked at this landscape and chose a different path entirely. They looked toward the automotive industry. In 1935, they released the Oliver 70. The breakthrough was not a matter of sheer size. It was a matter of mechanical refinement. Beneath the sleek, streamlined sheet metal of the Oliver 70 rested a high-compression, six-cylinder engine, an internal combustion power plant using 6 pistons moving in a continuous, overlapping sequence, effectively eliminating the violent vibrations of standard two-cylinder designs. To an American farmer accustomed to the punishing rhythm of older machines, stepping onto the platform of an Oliver 70 was a revelation. The engine did not bark, it hummed. The steering wheel did not rattle in the hands. The power delivery was seamless, offering a reserve of high-torque energy that allowed the tractor to pull through tough, dense patches of clay without stalling or requiring a frantic downshift. At approximately $900 in period currency, roughly $20,000 today, the Oliver 70 was priced competitively against the two-cylinder and four-cylinder domestic heavyweights. For a family farm emerging from the Great Depression, that price purchased more than just drawbar pull. The physical pulling force a tractor can deliver to an implement through the rear hitch. It purchased human endurance. A farmer could work 12 hours on an Oliver 70 and walk away without his spine aching or his teeth rattling. But a smooth engine was only the first half of the engineering moat that Oliver constructed. The true breakthrough, the mechanical leap that forced the entire American agricultural industry to play catch-up, arrived in the mid-1940s with the introduction of the continuous power takeoff. To understand this advantage, one must understand the mechanics of the harvest. A PTO, or power takeoff, is a rotating shaft at the rear of the tractor that transfers engine power directly to trailing implements, such as a baler, a combine, or a mower. In standard tractors of the era, the PTO was directly linked to the main transmission. If a farmer pulling a heavy hay baler encountered a thick, damp patch of crop, the baler would begin to choke. To prevent a catastrophic jam, the farmer had to press the clutch pedal to stop the tractor's forward motion and let the baler clear itself. But because the PTO was tied to the transmission, pressing the clutch also stopped the PTO shaft. The baler would instantly die, violently choking on the heavy hay. The farmer would then have to dismount, grab a pitchfork, and spend 30 exhausting minutes manually digging tightly packed crop out of the machine. Oliver eliminated this misery. They engineered a continuous or independent PTO, a power shaft driven directly from the engine flywheel, equipped with its own separate clutch, meaning it kept spinning at full speed even when the operator pressed the main clutch to stop the tractor's forward tires. The physical impact in the field was immediate and profound. In the heavy, humid alfalfa fields of Wisconsin, a dairy farmer pulling a baler could simply step on the main clutch when the crop got too thick. The tractor would stop rolling. The baler would keep running at full speed, swallowing and clearing the heavy hay. Once the machine was clear, the farmer released the clutch and rolled forward again. No jammed machinery, no broken shear pins, no lost hours with a pitchfork. This single mechanical advantage transformed Oliver from a respected alternative into an operational necessity. The competition could not easily replicate it without entirely redesigning their transmission housings. The American agricultural establishment quickly took notice. At the rigorous Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the ultimate proving ground where horsepower claims were independently verified under strict standardized conditions, the six-cylinder Oliver machines consistently posted exceptional fuel economy and smooth, unrelenting drawbar figures. Trade publications like Implement and Tractor and Successful Farming highlighted the automotive-style comfort and the continuous PTO as absolute benchmarks for modern farming. Across the country, specific regional ecosystems enthusiastically adopted the Meadow Green machines. In the expansive corn rows of Iowa, cooperatives praised the smooth torque for heavy, continuous cultivating. In the dairy operations of Wisconsin and upstate New York, the independent PTO made the brand the absolute standard for running forage harvesters and balers. In the demanding specialty crop regions of California's Central Valley, dealers found an eager market for a machine that offered precise speed control without ever sacrificing implement power. By the late 1940s, the dealer network spanning Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois was no longer selling a fragile merger of surviving companies. They were selling a premium engineering standard. The name on the Charles City Builders plate was not merely a brand, it was a specification. When World War II ended, the American agricultural landscape transformed overnight. The domestic economy surged. The returning generation of young farmers demanded machinery that matched the scale of their post-war ambitions. They were no longer willing to endure the punishing, bone-jarring ride of early mechanical tractors. They wanted power. They wanted speed. They wanted endurance. In 1948, the Charles City factory responded by launching what would become its crowning engineering achievement, the Fleet Line series. The Fleet Line consisted primarily of three-tiered models: the Oliver 66, the Oliver 77, and the legendary Oliver 88. Visually, the tractors were a masterclass in industrial design. The company abandoned the exposed utilitarian iron of the pre-war era. Instead, they enveloped the machinery in sleek, aerodynamic sheet metal. The tractors were painted a brilliant, unmistakable meadow green, accented by bright yellow wheels and a striking red grille. Under the dealership lights in rural towns from Ohio to Nebraska, the Fleet Line did not look like a crude agricultural implement. It looked like a locomotive built for the soil. But the aesthetics were merely a wrapper for overwhelming mechanical competence. The Oliver 88, the flagship row crop tractor of the era, was powered by a perfectly balanced 231 cubic inch six-cylinder engine. At the University of Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the ultimate independent authority for agricultural machinery, the Oliver 88 delivered an astonishing 41 drawbar horsepower. It achieved this massive output while maintaining exceptional fuel efficiency and running so smoothly that farmers joked they could balance a full cup of coffee on the hood while the engine idled. The American professional agricultural ecosystem quickly coalesced around the Meadow Green machines. The University of Nebraska provided the verified numbers. Implement and Tractor magazine published glowing industry reviews. But it was the sprawling, fiercely loyal dealer network that put the iron into the dirt. The regional adoption was highly specific and deeply entrenched. In the massive rolling cornfields of Illinois, local implement dealers sold fleets of Oliver 88s to operators who needed relentless pulling power for heavy multi-bottom plows. In the dairy cooperatives of Wisconsin, farmers financed the smaller Oliver 77 specifically for its continuous power takeoff, which allowed them to chop heavy forage without constantly clutching and stalling. In the specialized orchard regions of California's Central Valley, growers sought out the streamlined machines because the smooth six-cylinder power delivery prevented violent jerks that could damage delicate towed equipment. At the annual Farm Progress Show, the premier outdoor agricultural exposition where machinery was judged in actual dirt rather than on a showroom floor, the Charles City engineers routinely drew massive crowds simply by letting the tractors run under heavy load. This was the specific American cultural moment where Oliver transcended its status as a mere manufacturer and became a foundational pillar of rural prosperity. The early 1950s marked the zenith of the independent American family farm. Farms were consolidating, but they were still operated by families, not distant investment corporations. The fields grew larger, the implements grew heavier, the harvest windows grew tighter. During a suffocatingly humid October afternoon in the Illinois Corn Belt, where a massive autumn storm front threatened to flatten and rot an unharvested crop, the continuous power takeoff on an Oliver 88, pulling a heavy two-row corn picker, meant the difference between saving a family's entire annual income and watching the harvest drown. The machine did not jam. The engine did not overheat. The local dealer had the replacement belt stocked on the shelf. That was not a luxury. That was agricultural survival. To support this massive demand, the Charles City Assembly Plant became a fortress of Midwestern manufacturing. At its peak, the facility employed over 2,500 workers. The foundry poured thousands of tons of raw iron each month. The assembly lines ran with a synchronized, deafening rhythm, turning raw castings into precision-machined power plants. The town of Charles City did not just host the factory, it breathed with it. The economic heartbeat of entire counties in northern Iowa was directly tied to the number of rail cars loaded with Meadow Green tractors departing the rail yards every week. By the mid-1950s, the Oliver dealer network had expanded to roughly 2,500 independent franchises across the United States. These were not corporate showrooms. They were local fixtures, cinder block buildings with a parts counter, a grease-stained service bay, and an owner who knew exactly how many acres every customer farmed. The dealer, the mechanic, and the farmer all depended on the same Meadow Green iron. To truly understand the dominance of the Meadow Green machines at their peak, one must step onto the operator platform of an Oliver Super 88 during the spring planting season. The physical sensation of driving the tractor was entirely distinct from its competitors. When the operator engaged the hand throttle, the six-cylinder engine did not sputter or cough. It settled into a deep, rhythmic hum. When the clutch was released, the transfer of power was absolute. In the heavy, sun-baked clay of South Dakota, where a heavy, multi-bottom plow could stop a lesser tractor dead in its tracks, the Oliver simply leaned into the harness. The drawbar pull, the actual mechanical force delivered from the rear tires to an implement cutting deeply into the earth, was unrelenting. Because the six-cylinder engine fired in rapid, overlapping strokes, there were no dead spots in the power delivery. The rear tires did not hop or slip. The machine simply gripped the soil and pulled, every row, every acre, every season. By the late 1950s, the Charles City plant had evolved from a regional factory into a staggering industrial complex. The facility sprawled across roughly 300 acres of prime Iowa land. It was a self-contained manufacturing city. Raw steel and pig iron arrived by train on one side of the complex, and finished Meadow Green tractors, fully fueled and tested, rolled out on flatbed rail cars on the other. At the height of the post-war agricultural boom, industry records suggest the company was pushing tens of thousands of units into the American market annually. But Oliver represented something far deeper than mere production volume. In the social hierarchy of the American farm, the brand carved out a highly specific demographic. A John Deere or an International Harvester farmall was the default choice, safe, heavily marketed, and backed by massive corporate infrastructure. A Ford 8N was the utility choice for the small acreage hobbyist. But a farmer who purchased a new Oliver was making a deliberate, professional statement. They were signaling that they understood internal combustion. They were willing to pay a premium for smooth power, superior hydraulics, and the continuous power takeoff. The Oliver tractor became the ultimate symbol of the prosperous, independent mid-tier American family farm. It was the machine of the pragmatic professional. To maintain this engineering edge, the company constantly pushed the limits of mechanical force. In 1958, they released the monumental Oliver 990. Instead of utilizing their own engine, the Charles City engineers partnered with General Motors, dropping a screaming, supercharged, two-stroke Detroit diesel engine into the chassis. It was a terrifyingly powerful machine, generating roughly 88 drawbar horsepower. It was designed for the massive sweeping wheat fields of Montana and the Canadian border, where implements were incredibly wide and the distances were vast. It proved that Oliver could build heavy industrial pulling power just as effectively as precise row crop cultivators. Yet beneath this golden era of Meadow Green supremacy, structural fractures were quietly forming. The very things that made Oliver exceptional were also incredibly expensive to manufacture. A precision-balanced six-cylinder engine required tighter casting tolerances, more machining time, and more complex assembly than a crude two-cylinder block. The independent power takeoff required separate clutches and heavier internal gearing. The Charles City factory was running at maximum capacity, but the corporate profit margins on each tractor were perilously thin. Furthermore, the Oliver dealer network, while fiercely dedicated, was fundamentally comprised of independent local businessmen. They did not have access to the infinite, heavily subsidized corporate credit lines that giants like International Harvester could offer their buyers. If a farmer in Nebraska wanted an Oliver, the local dealer had to secure the financing. If crop prices dipped, that financing dried up instantly. But at the close of the 1950s, these financial realities were still hidden behind the roar of the foundry and the loyalty of the rural customer base. The dealerships were expanding. The assembly lines were moving, the Meadow Green paint shone brightly under the Midwestern sun. The company appeared entirely invincible, completely unaware that the American agricultural economy was about to undergo a brutal consolidation that would punish engineering excellence and reward pure, ruthless scale. By November 1960, the golden era of independent manufacturing in Charles City effectively ended. The Oliver Corporation did not collapse under the weight of a catastrophic mechanical failure. It was swallowed by a structural force it could no longer outrun: competition from consolidation and corporate farming. For 30 years, Oliver had survived by consistently out-engineering its larger rivals. But as the 1960s opened, the American agricultural market demanded a weapon the Iowa manufacturer simply did not possess: infinite corporate capital. The entire architecture of American farming was violently shifting. In 1945, there were roughly 6 million active farms in the United States. By 1960, that number was plunging rapidly as smaller operations were absorbed by their neighbors. Farms were consolidating into massive enterprises. The remaining operators required much larger, highly expensive machinery to cover the expanding acreage. To build a completely new tractor platform capable of generating 80 to 100 drawbar horsepower, a manufacturer needed tens of millions of dollars in research, development, and heavy tooling. Furthermore, to sell that expensive machine, the manufacturer needed an in-house financing arm to offer competitive, subsidized credit directly to the farmer. John Deere and International Harvester had the capital to fund both the factory expansion and the farmer's loan. Oliver did not. The independent Midwestern dealer network could not float the massive financial risk required to move heavy inventory. Enter the White Motor Corporation. Headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, White was a massive, aggressive conglomerate built on the manufacturing of heavy on-highway trucks. They looked at the agricultural sector and saw an opportunity for pure corporate synergy. On November 1, 1960, White Motor Corporation officially acquired the tractor and implement divisions of the Oliver Corporation. They did not buy the Charles City plant to preserve a legacy of agricultural craftsmanship. They bought it to instantly capture market share, absorb an existing dealer network, and establish a profitable agricultural division on their corporate balance sheet. Almost immediately, the dynamic inside the Charles City facility shifted. The original executives, men whose entire professional lives were bound to the soil and the rhythm of the planting season, were systematically replaced or sidelined by corporate managers from Ohio. These new directors evaluated the tractors exclusively through the lens of economies of scale, standardized parts procurement, and quarter-by-quarter profitability. The singular focus on engineering supremacy was replaced by a rigid mandate for manufacturing efficiency. Despite the tightening corporate grip, the engineers in Charles City managed one final brilliant era of mechanical innovation. In the mid-1960s, they rolled out the 100 series, featuring iconic models like the Oliver 1850 and the towering Oliver 1950. The 1950 was an absolute brute of a machine, utilizing a supercharged Detroit diesel engine that screamed at high RPMs and delivered roughly 105 PTO horsepower. It was perfectly suited for the massive wheat fields of the Great Plains and the heavy, demanding tillage of the Dakotas. But the true masterpiece of this era was the over/under hydral shift. The over/under hydral shift was a specialized planetary transmission unit mounted directly ahead of the main gearbox. It provided 3 shift-on-the-go speeds, direct drive, overdrive, and underdrive, for every single main gear. The physical application in the field was flawless. If a farmer in Illinois was pulling a heavy chisel plow across a consistent field and suddenly hit a dense, unyielding vein of wet clay, he did not have to stop, press the heavy foot clutch, and completely change the main gear. He simply pulled the hydral shift lever into underdrive. The tractor instantly slowed down by 20%, the torque output surged dramatically, and the machine powered through the hardpan without ever losing forward momentum. When the soil softened, he pushed the lever back into direct drive. It was a brilliant execution of applied mechanical force, keeping the implement moving, reducing operator fatigue, and maximizing daily fuel efficiency. With innovations like the hydral shift, the 100 series tractors sold reasonably well. The Meadow Green paint still moved off the dealer lots. To the casual observer walking through the Farm Progress Show in 1966, Oliver appeared as dominant as ever. But the foundation was quietly fracturing. White Motor Corporation was not satisfied with owning just one tractor brand. In 1962, they purchased Cockshut, a highly respected Canadian agricultural manufacturer. In 1963, they purchased Minneapolis Moline, another fiercely independent Midwestern tractor builder with its own loyal following. White Motor forced these 3 distinct proud engineering cultures into a single corporate division. To reduce overhead, the corporate directors in Cleveland ordered the factories to begin sharing components, chassis designs, and eventually entire tractor platforms. A tractor rolling down the Charles City assembly line might be painted Meadow Green and badged as an Oliver, but an identical machine was painted red and sold as a Cockshut in Canada, or painted yellow and sold as a Minneapolis Moline in Minnesota. The name stamped onto the builder's plate was no longer a guarantee of unique, specialized engineering. It was merely a marketing decision made in a boardroom in Ohio. The local Oliver dealers felt the shift first. For decades, they had sold their neighbors on the premise that Oliver was a specialized tool, distinctly superior to the mass-produced giants. Now they were selling corporate clones. As the 1960s closed, inflation began to rise. The cost of manufacturing heavy row crop tractors surged, aggressively squeezing White Motor Corporation's profit margins. The corporate parent began pressuring the Charles City plant to cut production costs, speed up the assembly lines, and reduce the heavy over-engineering that had originally made the Meadow Green tractors famous. The independent dealers watched the warranty claims slowly increase. The local mechanics noticed thinner castings, shared wiring harnesses, and cheaper hydraulic valves. The machine was slowly losing its soul, setting the stage for an absolute collapse when the agricultural economy finally broke. The dilution of the Meadow Green engineering standard was merely the symptom. The fatal blow arrived through a deliberate, calculated marketing strategy executed by executives who fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of the American farmer. By 1973, White Motor Corporation decided that maintaining three separate agricultural brands, Oliver, Cockshut, and Minneapolis Moline, was an unnecessary logistical burden. They wanted a single, unified corporate identity to compete directly with the monolithic green of John Deere and the unified red of International Harvester. The executives in Cleveland ordered the complete erasure of the legacy names. The transition was brutal and absolute. In 1974, the tractors rolling out of the Charles City plant were no longer painted Meadow Green. They were painted a stark, industrial silver, accented with charcoal black. The legendary Oliver shield was removed from the grille. The machines were rebranded entirely under the name White Farm Equipment, culminating in the release of the Silver Field Boss series. To the corporate accountants in Ohio, it was a brilliant consolidation of marketing resources. To the fiercely independent dealers in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, it was a devastating betrayal. A tractor is not a disposable consumer good. In the American Midwest, the color of a tractor's paint represented a generational lineage of trusted service, specific mechanical knowledge, and deeply ingrained dealer loyalty. When a farmer drove a Meadow Green Oliver, he knew exactly what engineering principles rested beneath the sheet metal. When that same farmer was presented with a silver white Field Boss, he saw a generic corporate commodity. The emotional and professional bond that the Charles City engineers had carefully forged since the 1930s was severed instantly by a spray gun. Despite the loss of identity, White Farm Equipment managed to move inventory through the late 1970s. But this was an illusion of success, driven entirely by a massive, artificial macroeconomic bubble. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union had caused American commodity prices to artificially spike. Farmers were flush with temporary cash, and they bought massive articulating four-wheel drive tractors to cover newly acquired acreage. The silver-white tractors sold, but they sold on the momentum of the market, not on the unique mechanical superiority that had once defined the Charles City brand. Then the second systemic force struck with devastating precision: farm credit cycles and political headwinds. As the 1970s closed, the American economy entered a period of severe stagflation. The Federal Reserve, desperate to curb runaway national inflation, aggressively spiked interest rates. By the early 1980s, the prime lending rate shattered the 20% mark. Simultaneously, the artificial grain export bubble collapsed. The value of Midwestern farmland, which farmers had used as collateral to finance their heavy equipment expansion, plunged rapidly. The resulting 1980s farm debt crisis was a localized economic depression of catastrophic proportions. Midwestern farmers were entirely paralyzed. They could not secure affordable credit to buy seed, let alone finance a new $60,000 silver tractor. In this environment of pure survival, the third market force took hold: competition from used equipment. Rather than signing a crushing high-interest loan for a new white Field Boss, farmers simply retreated to their machine sheds. They rebuilt the engines and re-welded the chassis of their 20-year-old Meadow Green Oliver 88s and 1850s. The old iron was paid for. It was familiar. It kept the farm alive. For White Motor Corporation, the timing was utterly terminal. The conglomerate was already drowning in corporate debt from its heavy truck division. When the agricultural market froze, the company collapsed. In 1980, White Motor Corporation filed for federal bankruptcy protection. The Charles City plant, the birthplace of the American gasoline tractor, was suddenly cast adrift. The agricultural division was spun off and purchased by a Texas-based holding company called TIC Investment Corporation. It was later acquired by Allied Products, merging with the New Idea Implement brand to form White New Idea. But these were merely financial maneuvers designed to strip remaining assets and manage a controlled descent. The Charles City factory was fundamentally too large, too old, and too expensive to operate in a collapsed agricultural market. The domestic dealer network, battered by the farm crisis and exhausted by the constant changes in corporate ownership, began to heavily defect. The strongest independent dealers sought franchise agreements with John Deere or the newly formed Case YH, desperate for the stability of a manufacturer with a functioning, subsidized credit arm. Without a robust dealer network to sell the machines, and without farmers capable of borrowing money to buy them, the factory floor in northern Iowa began a slow, agonizing suffocation. Production volumes plummeted. Entire wings of the massive 300-acre complex were powered down and sealed. The sprawling workforce of thousands was systematically reduced to a few hundred mechanics, assembling machines from remaining parts inventory. The end of the American gasoline tractor pioneer did not arrive with a dramatic mechanical failure. It arrived through the cold, relentless attrition of corporate insolvency. In 1993, after decades of fighting off corporate mismanagement and macroeconomic collapse, Allied Products officially ordered the closure of the Charles City facility. The corporate parent filed for bankruptcy. New holding companies stripped the assets. The loyal dealer network finally fractured. Midwestern farmers simply stopped buying them. The parts shelves slowly went empty. The Charles City foundry went cold. The massive assembly lines stopped moving. The factory gates were chained shut. The heavy machinery sat completely silent. The green paint was already gone. The fields went quiet. In 1993, the remaining agricultural assets of the White New Idea Equipment Company were formally purchased by the AGCO Corporation, a massive, rapidly expanding global agricultural conglomerate. AGCO acquired the surviving engineering patents, the implement designs, and the remaining parts distribution network. But they did not resurrect the Oliver tractor, the Meadow Green paint, the Charles City lineage, and the specific mechanical philosophy of the smooth, six-cylinder row crop machine were officially dead in the commercial market. Some names simply do not survive the brutal arithmetic of American agricultural consolidation. The silence of the brand is the ultimate conclusion of the corporate story. But the machines themselves stubbornly refuse to disappear. Across the American Midwest, an extraordinarily dedicated secondary market and preservation community emerged. The Hart-Parr Oliver Collectors Association, often referred to simply as the Oliver Gang, grew into one of the largest and most fiercely loyal historical machinery groups in the United States. In county fairgrounds from Ohio to Nebraska, at massive antique machinery gatherings like the Half Century of Progress show in Illinois, the Meadow Green tractors are not treated as static, fragile museum pieces. They are highly active, deeply revered mechanical artifacts. Private collectors, multi-generational family farms, and retired dealership mechanics spend tens of thousands of dollars and countless hours tracking down original engine castings. They meticulously rebuild the over-under hydraulic shift transmissions. They search estate auctions for authentic front weights and perfectly match the exact shade of the factory paint. They do not preserve these machines simply out of a vague sense of nostalgia. They preserve them because they represent a specific pinnacle of accessible, comprehensible engineering that modern agriculture has completely abandoned. A properly maintained Oliver 88 or an Oliver 1850 from the Charles City floor can still perform daily, rigorous work on a modern family farm. An Oliver can rake hay, pull a heavy grain wagon, power a manure spreader, or run a PTO auger just as effectively today as it did 50 years ago. This is not a novelty act. In a modern agricultural economy where a new row crop tractor easily costs $250,000, requires a proprietary dealer laptop to diagnose a simple engine code, and is permanently tethered to a corporate software subscription, a mechanical six-cylinder Oliver represents absolute independence. There are no emission sensors to fail. There are no digital control units to short out in a rainstorm. The machine can be completely rebuilt in a cinderblock shed with standard American hand tools. The farmer actually owns the iron, and the iron obeys the mechanic. Today, if you travel to Charles City, Iowa, the physical epicenter of this engineering empire is largely gone. The massive 300-acre industrial complex that once employed thousands, poured endless tons of raw iron, and defined the economic heartbeat of the entire region has been systematically leveled. The soaring smokestacks of the tractor foundry were brought down. The sprawling assembly lines were dismantled and sold for scrap. Much of the site is now just quiet, empty ground, while other parcels were repurposed for municipal use, including a local middle school. A modest tractor monument marks the historical location. The staggering, deafening roar of the drop forges and the synchronized rhythm of the tractor plant have been replaced by the quiet rustle of the Midwestern wind. An entire industrial city, a place that literally gave the American language the word tractor, was simply wiped from the map when the corporate capital retreated. Yet there is a distinct, unexpected footnote to the Oliver legacy that quietly outlived the tractors entirely. When AGCO dismantled the White New Idea Corporation, they preserved and heavily invested in the company's agricultural planter division. That planting technology, the highly precise seed metering systems originally developed from the deep DNA of the Oliver Farm Equipment Company and its early merger partners, became an absolute industry standard. Long after the Charles City plant closed its doors, modern high-horsepower tractors from rival brands pulled white-branded planters across the Corn Belt. The heavy iron of the Oliver tractor died, but the implement engineering survived to plant the American crop for another generation. The American story of the Oliver tractor reveals a profound truth about how the United States commercial culture operates. It highlights the vast, unforgiving gap between what the farming community claims to value and what the financial system actually rewards. Farmers deeply valued the heavy craftsmanship, the six-cylinder smoothness, and the localized, loyal dealer support that Oliver provided. But the agricultural market ultimately rewarded corporate consolidation, heavily subsidized credit lines, and brute force economies of scale. When a farm culture built on localized repair, mechanical endurance, and independence is replaced by a system of heavy debt financing and disposable technology, the superior machine does not always win. Sometimes it is simply starved of capital, rebranded, and erased. But the iron itself does not care about corporate balance sheets or boardroom decisions. Somewhere right now, idling quietly beside a sprawling, freshly turned cornfield in northern Iowa, a Meadow Green tractor still sits under the autumn sun. It still carries the heavy cast iron weight of the Charles City foundry, still bears the name of the men who designed it, and is still waiting for a hand on the throttle and a field that needs turning. See you in the next video.